"What do you say to a woman with two black eyes?" Darren James inquired. "I don't know. Can I get you some ice?" Vince Davis replied. "Should I call the police?" Billy Hunt questioned. "You don't say anything. I mean, geez, you've already told her twice," Darren chuckled loudly. Vince glanced at Billy, then shook his head. Billy's eyes reflected Vince's own look of disgust. "Really? This?" Vince thought to himself. "This guy acting like a jerk is supposed to be the amazing Darren James? Mr. Perfect in Stephanie's eyes?" Ever since meeting Stephanie James, Vince had been living under the shadow of the cold, bitter, vindictive girl's absent father. Anything Vince accomplished, her dad could do better. Any achievement was belittled by Stephanie. Any attempts at bonding with her were rejected. Every effort Vince made to warm her icy attitude was met with indifference. 7 years of enduring her attitude is finally coming to an end. Thank goodness, Vince comforted himself as he sipped his drink. "Come on, what's with this vibe, huh?" Darren shouted over the loud music. "Drink, buddy, drink. This is a bachelor party." Billy complied with his future father-in-law by finishing his drink, but Vince ignored Darren. He focused on one of the large screen TVs, which was showing highlights from that day's college games. Missouri River State and Mindy were being featured, and his eyebrows raised when the final score revealed that Missouri River State had barely edged out Mindy, 8-7. The Mindy Blue Jays were a tough team, and defeating them in their own stadium was no small feat. Vince watched the Blue Jays block the attempted point after with 53 seconds left, making it Pioneers 6, Blue Jays 7. Then the Pioneers kicker managed to land the kickoff on the 3-yard line. The Blue Jays lined up, snapped the ball, and 5 Pioneers rushed in to tackle the Blue Jay quarterback in his own end zone. "And that, Pioneers, oh Pioneers, is how it's done," Vince exclaimed as the Pioneers simply knelt to run out the clock and secure the win. "Want to know the trick to keeping your woman in line?" Darren shouted to Billy as he handed him a fresh drink. Hey, that woman is your daughter, remember?" Vince said, his face contorted with anger. "Oh, apologies, Mr. Sensitive," Darren mocked. "And she'd have to work hard to be called a woman of character," Vince thought. "That's about 3 steps up from what she is now." "Like I was saying on Saturday, you put her in her place," Darren laughed. "That way she knows who's the boss, who's in charge." "Yep." "Why don't you ask him how well that worked?" Vince reminded Billy. Darren shot an angry glare at the man who had married his ex-wife. "Hey, I hear you're getting married, honey?" a dancer purred, draping herself over Billy's shoulder. "Tell him, honey, tell him not to do it," Darren laughed. Vince had known he wouldn't be walking Stephanie James down the aisle. Her older brother David had been given that honor. And that was more than fine with Vince. David was a good young man, the kind any mother and stepfather would be proud to call their own. Then, 5 weeks ago, out of nowhere, Leslie had excitedly announced that Darren had contacted his younger daughter. "Isn't that wonderful, honey?" Leslie gushed excitedly. "Just out of the blue? Wow, that's something," Vince replied, though he couldn't help but feel a bit skeptical. Vince thought it was a real shame that Darren hadn't bothered to reach out when Debbie, Leslie's oldest child, had gotten married. It was Leslie's brother, Al Wooten, who had the honor of walking Debbie down the aisle with pride. At the time of Debbie's wedding, Al had been severely overweight, weighing 370 pounds, and struggling with diabetes. Since then, his health had deteriorated quickly, and he was now bedridden in a hospital bed in his Chicago living room. He wouldn't be able to attend his youngest niece's wedding. When Billy found out that Stephanie's father would be walking her down the aisle, he quickly asked David to be one of his groomsmen and extended the invitation to Vince as well. Billy genuinely liked Vince, as did Debbie and David. However, Stephanie had loudly and passionately protested the idea of Vince being involved in the wedding ceremony in any capacity. "Billy, I truly appreciate the gesture, but I'd be honored just to escort the beautiful mother of the bride," Vince had graciously told him. If Stephanie had her way, Vince wouldn't have even had that honor. But she kept her mouth shut, knowing that it was her mother and stepfather who were covering the hefty costs of the extravagant wedding. Darren, unsurprisingly, had to borrow money for his plane ticket to Chicago. Leslie had even suggested that Darren stay with them, but thankfully, David jumped in and offered his father a place to stay at his own apartment. As they were being fitted for their morning suits and top hats, Vince learned he was expected to contribute to the cost of renting an outfit for his wife's ex-husband. "And this constantly broke, always unemployed idiot just shows up out of nowhere?" Vince asked Leslie, barely hiding his frustration. Leslie brushed off Vince's question. and when he later tried to cuddle up and initiate some affection, she turned away from him coldly. "You need to drink," Darren bellowed into Vince's ear, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Man, do you really have to shout in my ear?" Vince shot back. "Come on, you wimp, just drink, huh?" Darren shouted again, clearly drunk. "Dad, seriously, this is Tiffany," David interjected, introducing the rowdy man to a young African-American woman with obvious enhancements. "Whoa, are those even real?" Darren slurred rudely, ink barely dry on his doctorate diploma from Missouri River State University. Vince Davis attended an engineering conference in Chicago, Illinois. Armed with multiple copies of his resume and a laptop ready with a stock cover letter, all he needed was to fill in the company's name and hit print. At just 26 years old, Vince circulated through the event, made some promising connections, and quickly realized that doctorate or not, there was still much to learn. Admitting as much to a man he met at the event earned Vince an interview with Colfax Sewage and Water. Although Vince had been focused on bigger cities like Chicago or St. Louis, Jack Warner from Colfax explained that much of the community was still on outdated septic tanks from the 1950s and 60s. The switch to a public sewage system was going to be a massive challenge. But Jack pitched it as an excellent opportunity for Vince to learn and grow. Vince agreed. It was indeed a fantastic learning opportunity. On his first day in the new office, Vince met Leslie James, the company's vice president of public relations and marketing. The 41-year-old warmly welcomed the new recruit and wished him well. Vince later bumped into her in the lunchroom and politely asked if he could join her. He noticed the wedding and engagement rings she wore and kept any attraction to himself. Standing at 6 feet, 1 inch tall, Vince had entered college on a partial scholarship as a wide receiver for the Pioneers. After earning his bachelor's degree, he dropped football to focus on his postgraduate studies in hydraulics engineering, but continued his strict exercise and diet regimen. So, at 26, Vince boasted a finely sculpted athletic physique that hadn't gone unnoticed, though he remained professional during his first meeting with Leslie. He had kept his sandy blonde hair in a ponytail throughout his master's and doctorate studies, but as soon as the diploma was in his hands, he cut it down to a neat buzz cut and donated the hair to Locks of Love. His warm brown eyes, strong nose, and straight white smile, thanks to years of orthodontic braces, made for a striking look. His dentist had once suggested extracting his third canine tooth, but without a valid reason, Vince chose to keep it. "So, how long have you been working here?" Vince casually asked Leslie the next time their lunch breaks overlapped. Leslie laughed, a bit embarrassed. "Oh God, I'm almost ashamed to say." "Why's that?" Vince asked, curious. "Because then you'll know how old I am," Leslie admitted. Vince noticed a few gray strands mixed with the brunette hair that had escaped her tightly pinned bun. He could also see faint crow's feet forming around her striking blue eyes. She had a slim nose and full lips that naturally formed a Cupid's bow. "I started right out of high school, pregnant with Debbie, that's my eldest. Chip Warner, Jack's father, really took me under his wing and helped pay for my night school," Leslie said with a smile. As she leaned forward, Vince couldn't help but notice the black lace of her bra peeking through her blouse, exposing her soft, fair skin. He tried to look away, but she was undeniably attractive. 24 years, 3 kids, and 1 divorce later, Leslie continued, but Vince realized he had gotten distracted, caught in the glimpse of her cleavage that had momentarily captured his attention. "So next year's your silver anniversary with the company? Wow, that's really something to be proud of," Vince said, genuinely impressed. "So you have been paying attention," Leslie giggled. Vince blushed, realizing she had caught him staring earlier. He grinned and shrugged it off. 2 weeks after Vince had started working at the office, Leslie casually let slip that she wasn't actually married. The rings on her finger were just a shield to fend off unwanted attention. She waved her left hand in front of him. "And yeah, I'm the one who paid for these rings," she revealed. "The one my ex-husband gave me. The diamond was so tiny you needed a magnifying glass to see it. Then turns out it wasn't even a real diamond, just one of those cubic zirconia ones, so yeah, I paid for these and I'm wearing them." Leslie explained that she had caught her ex-husband, Darren, in bed with the French tutor they had hired for their youngest daughter, Stephanie. They had gone to counseling and almost worked things out, but then the tutor, Lori, announced she was pregnant. "She claimed to be 3 months along," Leslie smirked, "but the problem was, I caught them 5 months earlier, so the math didn't add up unless they'd kept going. So, if I were to, ask you out to the House of May sometime?" Vince stammered, testing the waters. "Yeah, I'd say that's sweet, but you really need to find someone your own age, Leslie replied kindly. That didn't stop Vince from trying. Every week, despite their office using direct deposit, Vince made it a point to deliver his pay stub in person. He'd knock on Leslie's door, hold up the stub with a grin, and silently let her know he wasn't giving up that easily. "Just got paid," he would say with a grin. "Want to hit the dance floor?" And she would return his enthusiasm with a bright smile but shake her head in refusal. Then Stephanie threw one of her typical tantrums. She wanted to take horse riding lessons, but Leslie, as the sole breadwinner, was barely managing to cover the mortgage, her car payment, and David's tuition. "Why don't you call your dad? Maybe he can afford it," Leslie suggested, attempting to put on her earrings while hopping into her shoes. "Haha, very funny," Stephanie shot back. "What's so funny?" Leslie asked, not realizing that Darren had just been fired from yet another job. To Stephanie, it felt like her mother was highlighting her father's failures. Still stinging from the heated argument she'd had with her 14-year-old daughter, Leslie pushed the mouse back and forth, watching the cursor dance across the screen. A knock interrupted her thoughts. "Hey there, just got paid," Vince said, waving his pay stub envelope. "Want to hit the dance floor?" "Honestly, she can manage on her own," Leslie replied. "Yeah. Pick me up at what, 7:30? Their initial encounter was far from warm. Vince knocked at the door and a young teenager flung it open. They stared at each other for a long moment, him smiling, her glaring. "Hi, I'm Vince Davis," he said, grinning. "Is Leslie ready?" There was no response, and Stephanie slammed the door shut. "Mom," she shouted. "Jesus, what?" Leslie yelled back. "Some loser is at the door," Stephanie retorted. "Well, find out what he wants. If it's Vince, tell him I'll be just a few more minutes," Leslie barked. "No," Stephanie huffed, storming off to her room. Vince wondered if he had the wrong address. He checked his phone, recalling that he hadn't asked for her number. Just as he was about to walk back to his car, the door swung open again. "Hi, oh my God, sorry about that," Leslie apologized, finally appearing. "Huh? Oh, hey, I understand," Vince replied with a smile. I was a teenager once, too." "Uh-huh," Leslie muttered, still irritated by Stephanie's behavior. Leaning back into the house, she called up the stairs. "Stephanie, I am leaving." In her room, Stephanie heard her mother yelling but chose to ignore it. An hour later, feeling hungry, she finally left her room. "Mom?" she called out. "Mom?" At the steakhouse, Leslie was chuckling at a funny story Vince was sharing. Leslie laughed, but her smile faded when her cell phone chimed. "What?" she snapped. "What do you mean, what?" Stephanie shot back. "Where are you?" "I told you I'm on a date," Leslie replied, her tone tight. With that loser?" Stephanie yelled. "Goodbye, Stephanie, I'm hanging up now," Leslie said firmly. "What about dinner?" Stephanie screamed. "What am I supposed to eat?" "Have some cereal," Leslie replied. "I'm hanging up now." They resumed their conversation and continued eating. Throughout their meal, Leslie's phone rang twice more. Both times it was Stephanie. Leslie chose to ignore the calls. Stephanie got hold of Leslie's cell phone and blocked Vince's number. If she happened to answer the door when Vince came to pick Leslie up for a date, she would slam the door in his face. Plus, she wouldn't bother telling her mother that Vince was waiting outside. Vince managed to help Leslie unblock his number and called her as he pulled into her driveway. After Stephanie slammed the door, Vince knocked loudly. They became intimate after their 5th date. Leslie felt incredibly self-conscious about her 41-year-old body. If Vince noticed any flaws, he certainly didn't show it as he gently kissed and caressed her soft breasts. His hands lovingly cupped her curves as he knelt to explore her body. "Oh, you sweet dear," Leslie giggled, patting his cheek. Boy, Vince exclaimed. "Does this look like a boy to you?" "You know what I mean," she laughed. Stephanie was furious about having to share her breakfast with her mother's boyfriend. She sat and glared at him with disdain throughout the meal of eggs, bacon, and toast. Any attempts at conversation were met with icy silence. "You'll have to excuse her," Leslie snapped, shooting daggers at her defiant daughter. "She's just a teenager." "I used to be one too," Vince chimed in. "So what time is the basketball game today, Stephanie?" Leslie inquired. Stephanie didn't respond. "I asked," Leslie said through gritted teeth. It's right there on the calendar, Stephanie shouted. 1 o'clock. If you weren't so busy with your stupid boyfriend, maybe you'd know that, huh? Leslie, Vince said, pretending to be shocked. You have another boyfriend? Forget you. You're such a jerk. Stephanie screamed at him before storming upstairs to her room. Well, I guess someone will just have to stay home instead of going to their game, Leslie yelled up the stairs. A moment later, a door slammed. I think I better head out, Vince said quietly. You two need to talk, huh? Leslie gave him a gentle kiss at the door. Then, as the sound of Vince's car faded away, she stormed up the stairs. As their romance continued to grow, despite Stephanie's unreasonable and relentless hostility, so did Vince's role in the company. He was assigned to the biggest project they had secured, the North Lake Hospital. Their primary concern, besides sewage management, was properly draining the parking lot and grounds surrounding the 115-year-old building. Vince designed and led the installation project, impressing the hospital administration by overseeing the sewage system installation with minimal disruption to the hospital's operations. However, the drainage aspect posed a different challenge. Digging up sections of the parking lot meant they would need to resurface the area, and resurfacing required union labor. The execution of the project went relatively smoothly, with only a few minor issues arising, primarily due to the union employees and their supervisors. Vince took the $12,000 bonus he received from Jack Warner and purchased an engagement ring for Leslie. During a romantic dinner at Monticello's, Vince asked the lovely woman for her hand, and she tearfully and joyfully accepted. Debbie and David were both thrilled for their mother. Having met Vince during Thanksgiving dinner, they seemed to like him. Both had attempted to reason with Stephanie about Vince and their mother's need for companionship. Stephanie maintained a coolly polite demeanor towards Vince at the Thanksgiving dinner and was similarly indifferent to her mother during the meal. But as soon as she had the chance, Stephanie quickly retreated to her room. Give her some time, David suggested. The baby of the family just doesn't like sharing, Debbie added. Debbie stayed with Stephanie while Vince and Leslie enjoyed their honeymoon at the Grand Canyon. During their parents' absence, Debbie attempted to reason with Stephanie. David also visited frequently, trying to convince the stubborn girl to give their new stepfather a chance. Stephanie, however, remained resolute and refused to consider that Vince had any right to be in their home. Look, Stephanie, I know you're too young to remember all the crying when Daddy cheated on Mom, Debbie snapped. Because that never happened, Stephanie retorted. Well, dating leave whenever Stephanie's bitterness became too unbearable, but now that he was married to Leslie and still living under the same roof as the resentful girl, Vince found he had nowhere to escape. His car and Leslie's car became the cleanest in the neighborhood, as Vince washed, waxed, and vacuumed them whenever confrontational. Their garden turned into the envy of the neighborhood. When Vince ran out of chores to do on the cars, he began weeding the garden. He learned how to mulch, figured out what flowers bloomed in which seasons, and cleared away the clutter that had previously passed for a flower box in the front of the house. Leslie was of no help. She simply would not put her foot down forcefully enough with Stephanie. She wouldn't take the girl's side, but also would not take Vince's side in any argument. Then it rained. Not a light drizzle, the kind that wet the flowers and the grass, but quickly evaporated from the street. Not even the hard, pounding rain that soaked everything, but soon wore itself out. This rain lasted for nearly 4 days straight. It was a steady, constant pouring rain, a rain that pelted the ground relentlessly. In the 91 hours that it rained, 38 inches of rain fell on Colfax, Missouri. Soon the ground became saturated. When the ground became saturated, the relentless rain had nowhere to run off to. Streets became small rivers. Residents in low-lying homes had to be rescued as their homes flooded. And North Lake's hospital parking lot became a lake. Supplies had to be airlifted in. But no patients could leave, no new patients were received. The staff was also stuck there. Vincent Davis took the brunt of the blame for the failings of the hospital's drainage system. Pointing out that no one's drainage system had worked for the duration of the rain did little to dissuade the administration of the hospital. Colfax Water and Sewage shrugged sympathetically, but terminated Vince's employment. Stephanie all but screamed triumphantly when she found out about Vince's termination. She also pointed out to her mother that now that Vince was nothing but an unemployed freeloader, Leslie was having to support him. Vince was unemployed for much longer than he had anticipated. Weeks turned into months. During the time of searching diligently for a job, Stephanie continued her barrage of insults and snide remarks, and Leslie never once came to his defense, and woe to Vince if Leslie denied any of Stephanie's requests, demands. Stephanie always brought Leslie's refusal around to their lack of money, and their lack of money was Vince's fault. Their intimate life also suffered. The few times she acquiesced, Vince could tell Leslie was just going through the motions. St. Angelo, Illinois had a fledgling public water system. The rural community wanted to develop an irrigation system cooperative that could handle the area. The job was a government position, not a private sector job. Therefore, it paid nearly $7,000 less annually than his previous job. But it was a job. Like you made it rain, huh? Bert Yates asked when Vince was honest and upfront about the reason for his termination. Agreed, but I am the one that designed the drainage system, Vince told the county commissioner. It was now a 2.5-hour commute each way, but as Vince liked to say, it was 5 hours a day he did not have to put up with Stephanie. Stephanie seemed to agree. Their screaming tirades were confined to the weekends. Because of the long commute, Vince bought himself a modified Harley-Davidson Fat Boy lowrider. It was more fuel efficient, and it was a more pleasurable ride when the weather was nice. Leslie hated the motorcycle and complained bitterly about it. It was too noisy, it was too dangerous. Vince almost suggested that he would get rid of the Harley when she got rid of Stephanie. Leslie also harped on the fact that the Harley was an expense when Vince was making $7,000 a year less than he had been making. Any savings on fuel were eaten up by the added insurance costs. He finally talked Leslie into climbing onto the back of the bike and took her for a ride. He drove slowly at first, letting her get used to the motorcycle. Then he opened it up a bit more and felt her body press against his back as she held on. Out on the interstate, he had no choice but to really open it up and zip along. When he returned them, safe and sound, to their suburban home, Leslie did not wait for them to get out of the garage. She unzipped her jeans, pulled jeans and panties down, and bent over the hood of her car. "Mom, Ew," Stephanie said, jerking open the inside door. That was Leslie's one and only time on the motorcycle. It was weeks before Vince could persuade Leslie to make love again. When they did, the lights had to be out, the door securely closed and locked. It was another few weeks before Vince could persuade Leslie to adopt any other position besides missionary. Stephanie graduated from high school and was legally now an adult. She'd graduated near the top of her class and had academic scholarship offers from 5 colleges. She also had 2 athletic scholarships from 2 colleges. She was quite good at basketball. Vince prayed fervently that the girl would accept the offer from Norman's College in Loudridge, Texas, or the University of Louisiana at DeGard, one being nearly 22 hours away, the other being 15 hours away. He even tried some reverse psychology. He pointed out that Missouri River State was right there in Colfax, and was also his alma mater. Harvester's College was also in Colfax, and if she went to either college, she could live at home, rather than have the freedom of being out on her own. To Vince's shock and dismay, Stephanie did decide to go to Missouri River State. She sneered when she informed Vince that his being a graduate of that school had nothing to do with her choice. "It's probably because of Billy," Leslie guessed. "Don't know who this Billy is, but I hate him," Vince grumbled to himself. Upon meeting Billy Hunt, though, Vince did not hate the young man. He actually liked him, and Billy seemed to like Vince as well. Both men would sing the Pioneers' fight song together, each trying to sing it a little louder, a little more off-key than the other. "It's a guy thing, honey," Leslie giggled as Vince and Billy stood in the living room singing together. "Next thing you know, they'll be pulling each other's fingers." "Hey, Billy, pull my finger, huh?" Vince said. "Why sure, Pioneer, oh Pioneer," Billy agreed, sticking out his own finger for Vince to pull. "Quit it, huh?" Stephanie shrilled at Billy. "Remember courtship? That's the best it'll ever be," Vince reminded Billy. What's that mean?" Stephanie snarled at Vince. Now 3 years later, Vince sat in a bar with Billy David, 3 others from the bridegroom's party, and Stephanie's father. Vince had been genuinely pleased when Billy proposed to Stephanie. Stephanie had been in such a happy mood as she tearfully showed off her ring. She'd even mumbled a "thank you" at Vince, wishing her congratulations, and Vince wisely stayed out of the way, wisely agreed with whatever Leslie and Stephanie decided they needed for the wedding. His only suggestion had been that they might want to wait until they graduated from college before actually marrying. That suggestion earned him a scathing remark from Stephanie about staying out of her business. He was not her father. And a dissatisfied glare from Leslie. No, you're right, Vince agreed and left the room. Best marry him now before he figures out what a hateful little girl you really are, Vince said as he closed the door of the master bathroom. When Darren had suddenly, miraculously reached out to his baby, it was hard to tell who was more excited, Leslie or Stephanie. Wow, that really is something, Vince agreed, just out of the blue, huh? Upon meeting the man, Vince was less than impressed. Darren and Leslie had managed to have 3 children together. All 3 children were attractive young adults, and at least 2 of them seemed to have good heads on their shoulders. Stephanie was intelligent as well, but didn't seem to have much common sense. The first night Darren was in town, Leslie dressed in a red dress Vince had only seen twice. He'd seen it at Christmas time when she wore it for her office holiday party. Can remember when it was Christmas, Vince had commented, before Leslie stepped out of her closet. When she'd stepped out of her closet with that dress on, Vince had stopped talking. Down, boy, maybe later if you're good, Leslie had tittered, patting Vince. The next time he'd seen it was at their anniversary. I remembered how much you liked this dress, Leslie smiled when she met Vince at the House of May restaurant. Happy anniversary to me, Vince had agreed. Now she slithered herself into the dress, complaining about the few extra pounds she'd gained since the last time she'd worn the dress. Where are we going? Vince asked as Leslie hopped around, trying to put her pumps on. Stephanie and Darren and I are meeting to talk about the wedding, Leslie said. What do I have on okay? Vince asked, indicating his usual office attire of dress slacks and dress shirt. Honey, Stephanie and I are meeting with Stephanie's father, Leslie had said, meeting Vince's eye. She lightly kissed Vince's lips. And let's face it, she murmured, you're not exactly Stephanie's favorite person. And, you're wearing that dress to meet with your ex-husband? Vince asked. Let him see what he threw away, huh? Leslie smirked. No, Vince snapped. He doesn't need to see what he threw away. He knows what he threw away. Leslie ignored Vince's protest and swept out of the room. A moment later, the garage door slammed. Since Leslie wasn't there to complain, Vince went to the Rooster Pull, a club, and had a half-pound hamburger, add shoestring onion rings on that, Atomic House fries, and an ice-cold draft soda. The strawberry blonde on the stage was hot and she knew it. She didn't dance as much as she just wiggled and jiggled her attractive form. Anything else, cowboy? The friendly Asian-American waitress asked, a vacant smile on her pretty face. You guys still have that mint pie? Vince asked. Even after eating a large slice of the mint pie and drinking 2 mugs of their fresh ground coffee, Vince still made it home before Leslie and Stephanie. He watched a little television, but there didn't seem to be anything worth watching. Leslie returned, without Stephanie, and was revived. She was very much the aggressor as she shoved the dress down and off, leaving her in only thigh-high stockings and tiny lace panties. Vince briefly toyed with the idea of refusing Leslie's advances, but the sight of her in panties and stockings negated that idea. Over the next few weeks, there seemed to be more and more times Stephanie, Leslie, and Darren had to meet to discuss the wedding. Each time, Leslie dressed in her better dresses and took just a little more care with her makeup. The dinner meetings also seemed to take quite a while. Often the clock would be chiming 10:30, 10:45, and Leslie would just be coming in. The one time Vince put his foot down stating that he was accompanying Leslie and Stephanie, it was a very stilted meal. Leslie, Stephanie, and Darren did their best to shut Vince out, talking only to one another. During the dinner, the 2 times Vince attempted to offer his opinion or suggestion, Leslie clamped her hand on his. Vince, honey, Darren's speaking, she hissed. And Darren's wrong, Vince hissed back. We'd already contracted with Anne-Marie's Floral Designs. Vince also received a glare from Leslie and Stephanie when he asked why Billy wasn't there. After all, it was Billy's wedding also, and the smirk Darren gave Vince annoyed him royally. Unlike the previous times, Leslie was in no mood for intimacy after this dinner meeting. She made it clear that his presence and his interruptions were certainly not appreciated. Don't worry, it won't happen again, Vince shrugged. Vince knew he would never ever win Stephanie over. In the spoiled child's eyes, he would never measure up to her father, but somehow he seemed to be trying to win Leslie over as well. He seemed to be trying to measure up to Darren James, and Vince was not measuring up in his wife's eyes. During one of the dinner meetings, the last one before this bachelor party, Leslie had called Vince's cell phone. "Sweetheart, on the desk, top drawer, could you look and see if we told the caterer 50 or 60 people?" she asked. Vince went into her home office, slid open the desk drawer, and located the contract she was asking about. He read the particulars to her. "Uh-huh," he mumbled when she cheerfully thanked him. Underneath the bill for Stephanie's wedding dress, Vince was astounded at the amount. Underneath the bill for the dress for the mother of the bride, underneath the catering contract, was the bill and the statement from the private investigator. Vince read the report, noting that Leslie had been the one to hire the firm to locate Stephanie's father. It had taken the firm 4 days. Leslie had very little information about the man. Darren James obviously believed the computer was only for surfing for good content. He had no social media pages. "Has no social skills either," Vince muttered. But why would Leslie lie? Darren didn't just pop up. She went looking for him. Vince muttered to himself as he made himself a microwave dinner. The night of the rehearsal and the dinner following the rehearsal had been an exercise in diplomacy for Vince Davis. If he had thought Darren James was an arrogant jerk at the dinner meeting, at the bachelor party, the rehearsal and dinner following that solidified Vince's opinion of the man. At the rehearsal dinner, Stephanie, Leslie, and Darren sat with Billy, Billy's stepfather and mother, and Billy's stepmother and father. Their table was slightly raised above the other tables. Vince was seated at a table with Leslie's sister-in-law, Meg Wooten, and Meg and Al's daughter Bernice. Bernice was afflicted with Down syndrome, ate like an animal, and insisted on talking to Vince with her mouth full of food. Debbie and David both apologized to Vince about the seating mix-up. "I honestly thought you were going to be up there," David mumbled, nodding toward the elevated table. "Not wanted," Vince stated, not bothering to lower his voice. "No room for me, apparently." He lightly slapped David on the shoulder. "Make sure your mother gets home okay?" he asked, then left the restaurant. David attempted to chastise his mother for her, Stephanie's, and Darren's boorish behavior. "And putting him with Bernice," David said, voice thick with disdain. "Really? She's my cousin and I wouldn't want to sit with her." "Sweetheart, it's Stephanie's dinner," Leslie said weakly. "I had nothing to do with that." "But the minute you saw what was going on, you should have done something about it," David snapped. In front of her house, David looked at Leslie. The silence stretched for a few minutes. "May I remind you, I'm your mother?" Leslie snapped, ashamed at her lack of consideration. "Not acting like it, are you?" David replied. "I'll make it up to him after the wedding," Leslie snapped. "Don't see how you could," David said. "Just a few more hours, then it'll all be over," Leslie said and strode to the front door of the home. The next morning, Vince stayed out of the way as Stephanie, the hairdresser, the attendants, and Leslie all ran about screaming, whining, complaining. He drank a cup of coffee and ate a bagel on the back porch, well out of the way. "Honey," Leslie shrilled, opening the door, "you're not even dressed? The wedding's in—" "Take me 5 minutes to get dressed," Vince replied. It actually took him 9 minutes. There were pins jammed through everything, and Vince made sure he'd remove them all before dressing. Then he sat and waited for nearly an hour. Just when he was about to slip the shoes and coat off, the photographer insisted on some photographs of him with the bride's mother. Either the photographer didn't notice or she had taken all she was willing to take from Stephanie. But there was no comment about Vince's obviously extended middle finger when he posed with Stephanie. "Smile, sir, it's almost over," she joked when Vince stood with a beaming Leslie. "Yep, it is," Vince agreed and smiled sadly. The limousine whisked them to the chapel and Vince sat, ignoring Darren, Stephanie, and Leslie. But when Darren moved to assist Leslie from the rear of the limousine, Vince forcibly elbowed the man aside. "My wife, not yours," he glared at the lout. "Honey, please," Leslie snarled at Vince. The photographer motioned for them to smile, and the two did. The smiles looked more like glares, though. Inside of the building, the photographer again motioned for them to smile. Both had their emotions under control, and both did smile. Vince gave a nod to Billy and looked around the building. "Did a beautiful job on this place," Vince complimented. "Really did," Leslie agreed. "Hey, watch my hat, huh?" Vince said, then stepped out of the pew. "Honey, it's about to start," Leslie complained as the music built to its climax. "And I'm about to pee down my leg," Vince said. "Just watch my hat, huh?" He rapidly strolled toward the front of the church, then stepped down a hall just as the first bridesmaid and groomsmen began to walk down the aisle. He took one last look around, then stepped outside. Right where he'd left it the previous evening, underneath the tarp. Vince had driven it there after the debacle of the rehearsal dinner, then had an Uber driver take him home. He pulled the tarp off, dug his keys out of his pocket, and started the bike. Inside the church, the organ's music drowned out the roar of Vince's Harley as he rode away. Leslie was not smiling, quite irritated with her husband as the doors opened, and her daughter appeared on the arm of Darren James. Vince should be here with her, celebrating this moment with her. At the home, Vince wiggled out of the rented outfit, carefully put it back into the plastic covering, then sent Leslie a text message, reminding her to bring the top hat home. Then Vince wheeled the 4 suitcases down to the front door. He'd packed them while everyone else had been racing about, trying to get ready for the wedding. He smiled tightly. Stephanie had borrowed the suitcases, had packed them for her and Billy's honeymoon in Barbados. They were his suitcases. He'd had them before he and Leslie had ever started dating. Leslie had no right to give Stephanie permission to borrow them. Stephanie had not even bothered to ask Vince, had just gone to her mother. Vince had neatly stacked the contents onto Stephanie's bed. He had not done anything to the clothing, had not done anything to Stephanie's cosmetics, had not even tampered with her birth control pills. Vince took one last look around. He'd taken the framed photograph of his and Leslie's wedding that had graced his chest of drawers. He clutched it under his arm as he walked down the stairs. Then Vince decided he didn't want it. He didn't want the reminder of his failure. He placed it face down on the kitchen table, placed it at the chair he normally sat at. "Goodbye, Leslie," he said to the empty house, then wheeled the suitcases to his truck. The bike was already on the trailer. Vince checked everything again, then made sure the front door was locked. The alarm switched on. He then dropped the house keys into the front door's mail slot and stepped down to his truck. "Take care now," Old Man Carmichael said as he and his ancient beagle slowly ambled past. "You too, sir," Vince said. St. Elizabeth Parish Water and Sewage hired Vince after their telephone interview, following Bert Yates's glowing referral. He was also hired at the University of Louisiana at DeGard to teach a postgraduate course in irrigation systems. St. Elizabeth's Trauma Center didn't seem to know about Vince's failure with North Lake Hospital's drainage. He was given the job of designing that system for the hospital's expansion. Joe Godet was a good man to work for, and he also had a modified Fat Boy, a lowrider, 1 year older than Vince's model. Brian Bro, Vince's immediate supervisor, was a quiet, thoughtful man. Vince could see quite a bit of sorrow behind the man's eyes. Vince didn't ask Brian what his story was, and Brian didn't ask Vince what he was. The Dead End was a bar that had ice-cold beverages and some of the most delicious plate lunches Vince had ever tasted. The women who danced on the small stage were stunning, true beauties as well. At night, Sweet Peas served soul food that made Vince groan with contentment as he struggled to finish the delicious meal. He jokingly asked the very large woman if the cook was available. The woman fixed him with a stare, then smiled. "They're both single girls, from what I understand. You marry one, you got to take the other one too," she said. "Oh, well, Mama, I don't think I'm man enough to take them both," Vince replied. "No, that's right." The woman chuckled and greeted a new arrival. Vince had removed his wedding ring the night before Stephanie's wedding. It actually hurt that Leslie had not noticed he was no longer wearing his band. Now it was sitting in a dresser drawer, tucked out of sight. It was not readily visible, but even as it sat underneath the sweaters in a drawer, Vince thought about that ring. Apparently he and Leslie were still married. He had not left any forwarding address when he had left Colfax, Missouri, but he had not made any attempts to hide his whereabouts either. Vincent Davis wondered from time to time why he had not been man enough to woo Leslie away from Darren James. Darren James had lied to Leslie, cheated on her constantly, spent most of her money, then shirked all responsibilities to her and their children. Yet, Leslie had spent nearly $4,000 to track the man down. Then, when the man slithered back into town, Leslie seemed to want to spend every moment she could with the sleazy sociopath. She seemed to resent Vince's intrusion, and certainly did not appreciate Vince's opinion of Darren James. Belly full from the stuffed pork chops, Vince paid his bill, left a tip, then returned to his one-bedroom apartment. Vince's dad had once remarked, when he was living as a roughneck, going from oil field to oil field, he'd been able to pack his entire apartment in 30 minutes or less when he had to move to the next job. Looking around at his meager belongings, Vince wondered if it would take him that long to pack. Maybe if I stopped to make a sandwich, Vince thought, and turned on the small light that hung over the small dining room table. He graded the thesis one of his students had turned in. "Uh-huh, Monica, and you do that, you'll have your water table polluted with the runoff," Vince thought, and circled the offending paragraph. "We can't just look at where the water comes from. We have to look at where that water's going to go." He found several other glaring problems with the girl's proposal and circled them as well. Then, using his red pen, he wrote down each problem he'd encountered and why he would not accept nor approve her thesis. Vince knew Monica Proust would loudly, angrily protest and try to argue her position. Vince also knew he would point out that a thesis such as this was the place for her to present her case and argue her position. Then she'd take her complaint to Dean Melanson. If that old man actually grew a backbone, Monica would go to Dean Sims. But Ms. Monica Proust would not rewrite her thesis nor accept Vince's critiques of her work. The young lady seemed to do everything she could to make herself extremely unapproachable, in appearance as well as personality. "Weak excuses," Vince muttered aloud. "What happens when you coddle people too much instead of holding them accountable? Oh, and you showed up today? Guess we hand you a participation trophy." Weary, more from inner turmoil than actual physical exertion, Vince went to bed. As he did most nights, he wondered if he could have done anything differently. "One thing you can do is get the ball rolling," Vince said out loud. "Quit wondering when she's going to have you served and go ahead and have her served." But Vince knew he wouldn't. As he had predicted, Ms. Proust was furious that he did not accept her thesis. It actually amused him when the girl pointed out that she had double-spaced her work, made sure the pages were numbered, and set the margins correctly. "Monica," he sighed. "Ms. Proust," she snapped. "Whatever," Vince said, further enraging the girl. "It's not the formatting in question. It's the sloppiness of your work that I'm taking into account." Dean Melanson thoroughly reviewed Monica's thesis, took note of Vince's detailed critiques, and upheld Professor Davis's assessment, refusing to accept Monica's work. When Monica approached Dean Sims, he also read through her thesis and Vince's comments. He suggested that Monica seriously consider revising her work. "Ms. Proust," Dean Sims sighed, "I'm no expert in irrigation, but even I can see the gaps in your research. Redo it and resubmit." Vince felt a sense of satisfaction when both Dean Melanson and Dean Sims backed his critique. However, despite that small victory, he was still in a foul mood when he arrived at his office at St. Elizabeth's Water and Sewage. "Hey, Davis," Joe greeted him as Vince started up his computer. "Hey," Vince replied, entering his password. "That engineers' convention in Chicago?" Joe began, leaning against the door frame. "Already time for that again, huh?" Vince said, glancing at the calendar on his desk. "Yep, I went last year, Brian the year before, so it's your turn in the trenches this time," Joe said with a grin. Vince remembered that it was at a similar convention where he had met Jack Warner. That connection had led to his job at Colfax's Water Systems, and living in Colfax had brought Leslie into his life. Joe's smile widened, knowingly. "By the way, Bert Yates gave me a call, said Jack Warner's been asking about you. Then Jack called me himself. He's pretty interested in having you attend that convention." The mention of Jack Warner stirred up old memories, of professional triumphs, but also the personal journey that followed. "Got ahead of PR and marketing? Hasn't been the same since Vince walked out," Jack had confided. "Well, Vince is the best engineer we've got, but I can tell something's really weighing on him," Joe agreed. Vince glanced up from the schematics he was reviewing for the new recycling plant project in Kimball, Louisiana. Seeing the expression on Joe Gaudet's face, Vince realized there was more to this than just a routine convention. "No," Vince said, turning back to his schematics. What?" Joe stammered, clearly taken aback. "I'm not going to that convention," Vince said, eyes still on his screen. "Send Brian, send Tim, send whoever, but I'm not going." "Listen up," Joe snapped, his frustration rising at Vince's refusal. "If you're going to insist I go, you'll have my resignation by tomorrow morning," Vince sighed. "I've already sent the spec sheets to Brian Bro." "You're quitting?" Joe shouted, stunned. "Yeah," Vince sighed once more. Joe stormed out of Vince's office, knowing that if he stayed a moment longer, he might say or do something rash that couldn't be undone. Still fuming, Joe called Jack Warner. "Dang it," Jack sighed. "I was really hoping to send Leslie there and try to get them back together." Joe didn't say anything. He did think Leslie Davis must be pretty hard up if she wanted such an unhappy, stubborn man, though. "Please see if you can convince him," Jack pleaded. "If he could just see, I'm afraid she's going to do something sooner or later." Joe went for a ride on his sled, roared around the Greater DeGard area. Finally, head clear, he returned to the office. "Vince," Joe said, tone calm even. "Listen, I would really appreciate it if you'd go to this convention. You've been before, you know the drill. And as our best and brightest engineer, you'd be able to scope out what it is that we need here in St. Elizabeth, okay?" "No, Joe, no," Vince sighed and took a snapshot of his screen. He looked at the slowly reddening face of his supervisor. "No, Joe, send me anywhere but Chicago, okay? Send me to hell if you want to. But I flat out refuse to go to Chicago," Vince said quietly. Oakleaf County, Texas was in the midst of planning a new sewage treatment facility, and Vincent Davis was at the helm as the supervisor of the engineering department. His work ethic was undeniable. He often arrived before the midnight shift had even clocked out and stayed well into the afternoon, still at his desk long after the next shift had begun. Despite his consistent presence in the employees' cafeteria at exactly 12 noon each day, Vince always ate alone. He didn't discourage others from sitting with him, but he also made no effort to invite them. His lunch was simple, usually a peanut butter and apple jelly sandwich, and in the late afternoons, he'd return for a coffee break with an apple in hand. "Hey, Davis," Jason Fasterling, the chief operating officer, called out one afternoon around 12:10 p.m. "Yes, sir," Vince replied, looking up from his modest meal. "Damn, boy, I know what we pay you," Jason teased, glancing at Vince's sandwich. "We pay you enough to eat better than that." "But do you pay me enough to want to?" Vince countered, a rare smile forming. Jason chuckled before taking a seat across from him. "You, taught at that DeGard University, right?" "University of Louisiana at DeGard," Vince corrected him. "Yeah, I taught postgraduate irrigation systems and implementations. Why?" Jason rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Had a student, what was her name, Monica Proust?" Vince let out a groan. "Oh no, I remember her." "Any good?" Jason asked, clearly intrigued. "Tell you what, Fasterling," Vince said, picking up his sandwich again. "Have Ms. Proust send you her proposed thesis. Read it, and then get back to me." Later at 4 in the afternoon, Jason tracked Vince down again, this time catching him mid-bite into his apple. "God, what a worthless piece of work that was," Jason said, shaking his head in agreement after reviewing Monica's thesis. He then gestured toward Vince's coffee. "Please tell me that's not some of that hazelnut garbage." "Good God, no," Vince replied with a sneer. "This is 100% real Texas coffee, thank you very much." Jason grinned as he prepared his own coffee. "Good, good. Never could figure out why anyone would want to mess up a perfectly good cup like that." The man sat with Vince again, and the two sipped their coffee quietly. Then Jason sighed and looked at a spot over Vince's shoulder. "Read that girl's thesis," Jason said again. "It's worthless." "But it's formatted correctly," Vince smirked. "What, who gives a crap?" Jason asked, and a moment passed. "But she's got other criteria we need. How about we put her in inventory control?" the COO suggested. "What, you're saying we're hiring her?" Vince asked, surprised. Jason looked around the room. He determined that the 3 administrative assistants in the corner were too busy giggling to pay any attention to them. He did frown at one of the trio, a young man that had his hair styled into a bouffant hairstyle. Jason leaned closer to Vince. "Adams has got it in her damned head we're lacking diversity," Jason whispered. "Seriously," Jason said, standing up. "Other than your class, she carried a 4.0. Let's see what she can do for us, huh?" Monica Proust joined Oakleaf County Sewage Treatment in the inventory department. Her first day was spent doing the mountains of paperwork and watching the WebEx seminars all new employees had to go through. So it was not until her second day on the job that she saw Vince Davis. Vince was shocked when the young lady actually gave him a wide smile and a friendly wave. He didn't return her smile, but he did wave in greeting. At lunchtime, Monica was seated with a few of the administration assistants and seemed to be comfortable with the group. She didn't see Vince until it was time to leave the cafeteria. Again, she smiled and waved. Vince nodded that he'd seen her and resumed eating his handful of pretzels. "Oh, that's Vinny," Troy Lopez said. "I swear he is so unfriendly." "Troy thinks that anyone that doesn't fall madly in love with him is unfriendly," one of the girls whispered loudly to Monica. I'm not even going to think of something to say, Troy said, swishing away from the table. Vince watched the interchange and shook his head in mild disgust. He wondered if anyone had the courage to tell Troy Lopez that he looked positively ridiculous with that hairstyle. 2 weeks later, Troy Lopez was finally terminated. The young man had been hired to be an administrative assistant, but if he found a job to be too difficult, he simply ignored it. If given a deadline, Troy would push the job off onto someone else. I love him like a brother, Mia Sanchez complained to Coretta Adams, the chief executive officer of Oakleaf County Sewage. But someone needs to tell that boy to do his own job. Know what I'm saying? With the termination of Troy Lopez, Mia and several other administrative assistants found a mountain of paperwork on their desks. Troy's laziness had created a backlog, and much of it was time-sensitive work. So at 12 noon, Monica Proust found herself in the cafeteria, alone. So she went and sat at Vince's table. She sat at the table, started to eat her tuna salad, and texted on her cell phone. That's pretty rude, Vince snapped after 10 minutes had elapsed. Huh? Monica asked, finally tearing her eyes away from her cell phone screen. You don't even ask if you can join me. Just plop yourself down, Vince snapped. He'd very nearly said plop your rear down, but fortunately paused long enough to correct himself. Then no. Hello, how's your day going? No, nothing. Just whip out your phone and start texting someone else, Vince continued. Going do that crap. Why even bother sitting here? You can text from any table here. He stood up and left the room before his anger got the better of him, before he said something he'd be written up for. At 4 p.m., Vince almost did not go into the cafeteria. Then he reminded himself. He had every right to go into the cafeteria, had every right to enjoy his apple and his coffee. Hi, Dr. Davis, can I sit here? Monica asked. Absolutely, Vince smiled tightly and bit down on his apple. But, don't need to call me Dr. Davis anymore. It's just Vince. The girl smiled, and Vince was struck at how attractive the young lady actually was. In his classroom, Monica Proust had dressed as dowdy, as drab as possible. She kept her blonde hair back in a severe bun, or a simple ponytail, kept her face devoid of any cosmetics. Here, her outfit was smart, fashionable. The skirt was a knee-length navy blue, and her blouse was a soft pale yellow. Her blonde hair was loose, hanging down to the small of her waist. Her face had been touched up with light powder, a little eyeliner, and some lip gloss. Vince did think to himself that Troy Lopez had worn more cosmetics than Monica was wearing right now. So, when did you start working here? Monica asked as she sipped her coffee. First week in June, Vince said. I'm sure you had something to do with me getting this job here, Monica whispered, looking at Vince. Her warm brown eyes searched his face. Vince gave her a wry smile. Not really, he said truthfully. The hard work you put in at ULD had a great deal to do with that. She smiled proudly at his compliment. She took another sip of her coffee, then looked at the apple Vince was eating. Where'd you get the apple? She asked, looking at the service bar of the cafeteria. From home, Vince said. Oh, where are you staying? I got an apartment. The Crossbow, no, the Oxbow off of 72, Monica said. I, bought a condo, East Lawn Condominiums, Vince said. East Lawn? Where are they? Monica asked. On the other side of Oxbow Lake, Vince said. From here, take a left on Maricel, then another left on Tucker Drive. So you go right past my apartment, Monica said. Yep, sure I wake y'all up when I'm on my hog, Vince agreed. Your hog? Monica asked, pretty face wrinkled in confusion. My Harley, Vince corrected and washed down the last bite of apple with the dregs of his coffee. You still have that? I liked the American flag paint job it had, Monica asked. Still have it, he agreed. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but Vince was already throwing his coffee cup and apple core away. See you later, Dr. Davis, Monica said. Sections of Highway 72 had to be torn up and 12-inch pipes needed to be ordered and ready for the job. Residents in all of Oakleaf County would be impacted by the job, so inventory needed to be ready, and at the job sites when they were needed. 1 hour, just one flipping hour delay and we're in deep doo-doo, Vince stressed as they planned the project. Haha, cute, Monica smirked. What? Vince snapped. Deep doo-doo, Monica said. We work at a sewage plant. Ms. Proust, there is a time for joking and a time to be serious. Guess which one this is? Vince snapped. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back and set her jaw firmly. Is the inventory ready to go? He asked. Yes, sir. she said, voice cracking as she fought to keep her emotions in check. Equipment ready to go? Vince asked Pablo Resendez. Yes, sir, Pablo agreed. Everything's already on the trailers. Permits already pulled? Vince asked Jason Fosterling. And in Pablo's hand, Jason assured Vince. And Ms. Proust? Vince said. She looked up from her papers. Her eyes were still quite shiny, and her nose was becoming reddened. Yes, sir? She asked. Ms. Proust, I am very sorry that I snapped at you like that, Vince said in front of the supervisors. I realize you were just trying to make me tone down my delivery, and I took it the wrong way. Monica looked around the room at Coretta Adams, Steve Adams, the chief financial officer, and no relation to Coretta Adams, Vince, Pablo, and Jason. Monica nodded her head in agreement. Thank you, Ms. Proust, Vince said, gathering up his own papers. Okay, everyone. We start tomorrow morning at 9:30, after the morning rush hour has died down a bit. Vince stormed out of the boardroom before anyone could stop him. He had not been sorry in the least that he'd snapped at Monica. This was serious. Timing was vital. And one screw-up would put them in jeopardy with the citizens of Oakleaf County. Many were already complaining about the hike in their sales tax. Many more were upset that their sewage would be tied in with their garbage service. Sections of highway being torn up while crews stood around waiting on a section of pipe or a backhoe or asphalt would not endear them to the populace one bit. Yeah, Leslie, did teach me one thing, Vince smiled tightly as he grabbed his helmet off of his desk. He and Leslie had discussed on several occasions how just one unhappy client can adversely affect business. Every happy client tells maybe 2 or 3 of their friends, Leslie pointed out. An unhappy one, they'll tell no less than 10 people. Vince did something he rarely did. He left the office early. He was already quite upset with Monica. She'd asked why they were using 12-inch pipe instead of 18-inch pipe. It's only a few pennies more per foot, she'd pointed out, and the volume is larger. Ms. Proust, when we're talking several miles, a few pennies becomes thousands of dollars, Steve Adams quietly said. Also, Ms. Proust, Vince had said, trying very hard to keep his frustration in check. I am sure you know how the diameter of a pipe affects pressure and flow rate? Instead of turning south on Highway 72, Vince turned north. He drove through Oakleaf, not seeing the trailer parks, the strip malls, the convenience stores along the way. He did see the Connolly College campus and did see the Connolly Cougars Stadium. He turned left at Stadium Drive, then right at Connolly Way. Finally, he rumbled to a stop at Tijuana Jack's. Tijuana Jack's had 3 things going for it. Its beverages were ice cold. The girls were Texas pretty. And Tijuana Jack's ignored the Oakleaf County ordinance that required certain clothing standards for dancers. He showed his TJ pass to the doorman. The man smiled and wished Vince a good day as he opened the door of the squat building. On the stage, a blonde was gyrating to Pantera's Walk as she pulled her panties. As the song died out, she let the material go and smiled a vacant smile. Another song started, and the dancer now discarded her panties and strutted around the stage, dressed in only her 5-inch pumps. One other thing Tijuana Jack's had was a half-pound hamburger, served with a pound of cayenne-dusted, thick-cut French fries. Help you, bud? A grizzled man asked as Vince straddled the bar stool. Soft drink and what the heck, burger and fries, Vince ordered. Well, medium well, the man asked. Medium well, Vince said, knowing no matter how he ordered his burger it would be very well done, almost burnt. The soft drink came first, and 8 minutes later the heavy platter was shoved in front of Vince. He bit off the end of the mustard packet and doused the burger with the yellow condiment. Then he sank his teeth in and let a smile crease his face. Yeah? The bartender asked, then chuckled. Yeah. Yeah, Vince agreed, washing his mouthful of food down with the last of his drink. An Asian-American girl with quite large breasts trolled among the clientele, trying to entice a customer for a 15-minute visit to the private room. How much? Vince asked, even though he had no desire to go to the private room. 100 for the room and, whatever you decide to tip the dancer, the girl said. And I've never had any complaints, she whispered enticingly into Vince's ear. Really? I have, Vince replied. He wanted a second drink. He wanted to take the blonde dancer, the one who had been on the small stage when he'd entered the bar, into the private room. She looked somewhat like Monica, only in the fact that they both had blonde hair. And in Vince's bitter state of mind, both were utterly frustrating. But the blonde was already leading a happy man toward the area where the small private rooms were. The only other girl on the floor was another woman, but this girl had a loud, grating laugh. "Don't think so, sugar," Vince told the Asian girl, but slipped her a $5 bill. "Get yourself a drink, okay?" "Thanks, sugar," the girl smiled, then turned to the next customer. "Whoa, whoa, buddy," the doorman said when Vince strolled out. "Dude, just got here, huh?" "Just needed one of those burgers," Vince said. "And, hey, burgers in them fur burgers?" "Heard that, buddy, heard that," the man chuckled, and the two bumped fists. Roaring down Highway 72, Vince saw Monica pulling into the Oxbow Apartments. He did not acknowledge that he'd seen her. As far as he knew, she had not seen him either. She had seen him. Pulling into her parking space, she hung her head and sat quietly for a few minutes. Her permissive mother and absent father, combined with the inadequate public educational system, had done little to prepare Monica Renee Proust for the real world. She had done well on tests. She did have a remarkable knack for retaining information. In college, many of her grades had been given to her simply because the instructors grew tired of arguing with her. She had a master's in mechanical engineering. Vince Davis's refusal to accept her proposed thesis had kept her from entering the doctorate program, and by that time the money for tuition had dried up. It was time for her to obtain employment. Again, Monica found that she was competing mainly with herself. The few places that had shown any interest in her had followed through with speaking with her professors at the University of Louisiana at DeGard, and not a single one of her professors had anything kind to say of Monica Proust. Spent nearly every class arguing why she should get an A, and when you finally gave it to her just to shut her up? Spent the next hour arguing about her next assignment, Dean Melanson sighed, when Clay Chopin with St. Elizabeth's Distillery called. Gave her a C on her midterm? In physics, next thing I know, I'm in Dean Sims's office answering to a discrimination complaint, Professor Huxton snapped when King Sanitation called for a reference. She kept widening the circle of her search, which kept widening the circle of rejections. "Oakleaf, where's that?" Monica's mother had asked. "Texas," Monica said, temporarily losing her happy mood. "Bob always said there is no gravity in the state of Texas," her mother smirked. "Reason people in Texas don't just float away? Texas sucks." Bob was Monica's absentee father. As Monica had never met the man, his opinion of Texas didn't matter to her. A quick search found an apartment, actually, a room in an apartment in Oxbow Apartments. Her roommate was Michelle Garcia, an extremely attractive Latin girl. The two girls would be splitting the $750 rent down the middle, as well as the utilities. Beautiful or not, Michelle was a bit of a slob. She was also quite loud whenever she was talking. Even when Monica was agreeing with Michelle, Michelle would often end up arguing to prove her point. "So she's your twin?" Renee Proust asked when Monica called home to complain to her mother. Michelle was also quite promiscuous. It was rare that Michelle did not have a guest spending the night. Since their bedrooms were next to each other, Monica had no choice but to listen to the sounds of two people being intimate. Spent nearly every class arguing why she should get an A, and when you finally gave it to her just to shut her up? Spent the next hour arguing about her next assignment, Dean Melanson sighed when Clay Chopin with St. Elizabeth's Distillery called. Gave her a C on her midterm? In physics? Next thing I know, I'm in Dean Sims's office answering to a discrimination complaint, Professor Huxton snapped when King Sanitation called for a reference. She kept widening the circle of her search, which kept widening the circle of rejections. "Oakleaf, where's that?" Monica's mother had asked him. "Texas," Monica said, temporarily losing her happy mood. "Bob always said there is no gravity in the state of Texas," her mother smirked. "Reason people in Texas don't just float away? Texas sucks." Bob was Monica's absentee father. As Monica had never met the man, his opinion of Texas didn't matter to her. A quick search found an apartment, actually, a room in an apartment in Oxbow Apartments. Her roommate was Michelle Garcia, an extremely attractive Latin girl. The two girls would be splitting the $750 rent down the middle, as well as the utilities. Beautiful or not, Michelle was a bit of a slob. She was also quite loud whenever she was talking. Even when Monica was agreeing with Michelle, Michelle would often end up arguing to prove her point. "So she's your twin?" Renee Proust asked when Monica called home to complain to her mother. Michelle was also quite promiscuous. It was rare that Michelle did not have a guest spending the night. Since their bedrooms were next to each other, Monica had no choice but to listen to the sounds of two people being intimate, Monica vowed that as soon as the 6-month lease was up, she would not be renewing with Michelle. Every dollar she could save was stashed away to go toward getting a 1-bedroom unit in the complex. With a sigh, Monica got out of her car and wearily walked up the flight of metal stairs to the apartment. Gratefully, she observed that she could not hear Michelle's music blaring and thumping. "Hey," Michelle cheerfully greeted Monica, toweling her long black hair. "Hey, going out?" Monica asked, not smelling any food. "Yeah, Eddie's taking me to Casa Ole," Michelle said, turning to go to her room. As Michelle turned, her towel slipped from around her body. In that brief moment, Monica realized something unexpected about her roommate. You, Michelle, you're a man," Monica stammered as Michelle squealed and quickly grabbed at the towel to cover herself. "And that's how my day's going," Monica said to herself as Michelle slammed the door to her bedroom. Monica was eating a ham and cheese sandwich when a hotly blushing Michelle left her room, dressed in a dress that barely reached past her mid-thigh, her feet in a pair of high heels. "Good night," Monica quietly said. "Yeah," Michelle whispered. "There were mishaps. There were bound to be mishaps. No project covering such an expanse of miles, involving so many crews, would be perfectly choreographed. Vince actually rode shotgun with Pablo, or with Jim Tucker, Pablo's right-hand man, for the first week. In the second week, Vince took his own crew out and worked alongside the men. When they hit snags, Vince wasn't in his office relying on Pablo or Jim or whoever to describe the issue. Vince was right there, able to see the problem for himself. He could call Jason and tell him what they needed. "Damn it, Vince, making the rest of us look bad," Jason complained. "Oh, so it's working?" Vince joked. "Hey, come on, Vince," Jason said when Vince called in that they needed some couplers and valves. "Call Miss Proust. That's what we're paying her for." Vince set his jaw and dialed her extension. "Ms. Proust," she answered, her voice professional. "Ms. Proust, Vince Davis here," Vince replied, his voice also professional. He relayed his need, provided his location, and ended the call. He was very surprised when Monica arrived at the site, riding shotgun with one of the laborers. She stayed out of the way, but watched as the men grabbed the inventory and began an almost frenzied pace of coupling the heavy pipes. It was like a ballet, set to loud machines and shouts.